Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending the panel today. It's great to see everybody and see the attendance here. The title of this panel is Key People Decisions in the C-Suite, but I think we're not going to focus just our attention on those C titles, because in many of these small enterprises, it takes a couple of years of operations before there's enough budget and infrastructure to really necessitate, any of those people in those key positions. But the roles we find are being filled by a variety of people in a variety of different levels, a variety of titles. So I think the comments that we're going to have are going to be widely applicable to any kind of smaller enterprise that's going through this transition phase. We're fortunate to have three experts with us to weigh in on their experience to address these items: Andrea Crane, Mark Sinatra, and Eric Wilson. And I'll let them introduce themselves. Andrea?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Crane. I'm a Kellogg 2016 grad, and I actually attended this conference as a student, so it's an honor to be here up here today. After graduating, I went to Alpine Investors and did their CIT program. Worked for 2 different portfolio companies, and then I went to Pacific Lake Partners and was COO of a portfolio company there before starting my own executive recruiting firm called Bigwin Talent.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Mark Sinatra. Did a search back in 2008. Ended up acquiring a HR outsourcing company that initially had about 40 employees. We had a tough downturn in the first couple of years. I took it down to as low as 26 employees at our low point. And then when we sold it in 2017, we were at 65 employees. So I've seen a lot of fluctuation, and had to deal with that in terms of hiring and developing and terminating employees. After I sold the company to a large strategic, I was running the western half of the country for that organization called Oasis Outsourcing. That was backed by Stone Point Capital and Kelso, and I had a P&L that covered about 250 employees over the western half of the country. And then I exited that after they sold to a public company and started investing in search funds through ETA equity, and have backed over 50 search funds today and 20 transactions. So glad to be here today.
Good afternoon, Eric Wilson. I'm a Darden 12 grad, but proud resident of Chicago for the last 11 years here. Post-MBA, spent my first, 7 years as a consultant. I was at McKinsey, which has been mentioned a few times today. From there, went over to Vista Equity Partners and was part of their operating team, doing a lot of work around talent building at our portfolio companies, or rather at their portfolio companies. And then for the last 2 years, I've been at NextGen Growth Partners. I joined the firm to really stand up and develop a portfolio operations function, and spend all of my time working with our CEOs across our 8 portfolio companies.
Thank you. So I think everybody on this panel has direct experience with all the challenges as it relates to hiring and terminating and evaluating the team. And the way that we're going to run the discussion today is focus on just a couple of different themes. First off is just some basics around hiring and evaluating, and any methodologies, some tactics that prospective CEOs can think about as they're getting involved in these smaller enterprises. So Andrea, the first question I would have is, what sort of basics would you advise a new CEO to go through before they actually start that hiring process? What sort of things should they make sure that they've got alignment on and clarity of thought on before they decide, okay, I'm going to go out and start looking in the market?
Yeah, so if that's assuming they've done an acquisition already.
Correct, when they're in that CEO seat.
When they're in the CEO seat. It's the thing that I see a lot of people make a mistake on is not getting the basics correct. So first, write down what you think you want when you're going to hire someone, and then work with the people who are on your leadership team and have individual meetings with them, so you don't let each other, the people on the leadership team anchor each other, and see what they want, and then take that and make a job description and share the job description back to make sure you captured what they think they want. The biggest thing is alignment, and you'd be surprised at how many people don't go through really the basics of just trying to understand what they're really looking for, which if you don't get that right, the whole hiring process, you'll not end up with the type of candidate that you're looking for.
Any experiences you've had, anybody on the panel, where a new CEO has made a hire without going through those really thoughtful basics in advance and had to go back, shortly thereafter within the span of weeks or months and refilled the role?
Oh, yeah. That would be me. Just, I guess, why I'm on the panel. Yeah, I remember when it was about year 2, we were looking to really expand the sales team nationally, and I had in my mind this vision to hire like a high-powered, experienced, SVP of sales that came from a very large competitor. And, there were a couple folks on the sales team who were highly valued, they produced well, that weren't necessarily, I didn't really, certainly I'm not saying ask for approval, but I don't think I really aligned with them well on the type of hire and this particular individual. And it ended up not working out, partly for that reason, but also partly for, which is, I think, a really interesting topic for us to dive into at some point, is the type of hire that really excels in a search fund operated company sometimes has behavioral attributes that could be different than an executive of, Fortune 500 company, right? Very different skill set. And I had totally kind of mismatched what I thought I needed versus what I actually needed, and but was able to course correct at some point on that.
So when you went out to the market, you were initially thinking that it was going to be more of a traditional role that would fit into a larger organization, but you quickly learned that it was more of an entrepreneurial role that would actually be successful there?
Yeah, I mean, if I look back at a couple of the hires that I got wrong, certainly one category would be, hiring, a mid to senior level executive that had, really, I would say impressive experience, but at a much larger organization that was much more structured, had more resources, just operated, at a different level, thinking that the results would translate into my organization, which was very different, right? A lot smaller, not as many resources. You got to wear different hats, be fairly agile, and looking back now, I think just some of those kind of behavioral attributes just weren't really a recipe for success in what I saw as my organization at the time, which is probably very similar to a lot of the companies that you guys run or are about to acquire in the next 2 years. Kind of smaller, faster, just being more flexible, change management, things like that I think are really critical.
So, and this would be a question, I think, for anybody on the panel, but these are smaller businesses, but they're looking for really top talent. How do they get access to those talent pools? Any suggestions on where they should be looking for candidates that are going to meet the needs, that aren't just going to, that would have no other reason to know this business because it may be, small relative to what their consideration set?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think the first step that we take to place any role is to look within our networks. So that this is an NGP specific answer, but we've got an advisory board, we've got a firm behind you, and we'll tap our personal networks to try to find as many folks as we can. We tend to know people that maybe they're interested in working in a small business but don't want to quite take the full ETA leap. So they'll come in and take various executive roles. But I think working that network is an important first step, because not a lot of people are looking for jobs at really tiny companies that they don't know exist. So it's usually word of mouth and someone that you know to get the right folks in the door.
Any advice on that sales process, though, to that key candidate, given the fact that it's a small business that, if you look at on paper, is not going to be something that they're going to be necessarily the right career move?
Yeah, I think it's really about finding someone who wants to grow with the business. We hired someone. They're starting, I think, next week. And I talked to them through the interview process, and it's like, here's the expectations in the first 6 months of the job looks like a director of finance. The next 12 months looks like a VP of finance, and years 3, 4, and 5, you're decidedly a CFO. And you're going to grow into the role, and we're not hiring a CFO on day one, but we expect to see someone kind of go through that experience. And then before you know it, you'll be the CFO of a company that's had a great track record of acquisition and ideally had a fantastic exit. And if you deliver that pitch and it lands and it resonates and they love it, then great, you probably have the right mutual fit. And if it doesn't, then that's not your candidate. So.
Andrea, any advice on how to evaluate those candidates after you've sourced them and you're bringing them through? What sort of tactics would you use to make sure this person actually is the right fit and you're addressing all of the unknowns? or as many as you could?
Yeah, it starts with the alignment, the first thing that we talked about. When you have candidates, one, I would make sure to involve other stakeholders in the interview process, whether it's your leadership team, your investors, your advisors, to get additional perspectives. Assessments are very popular, whether you're using predictive index, human intelligence, Myers-Briggs, DISC. So whatever the language of your company is, I would continue to use that. And then you can also do case studies. I have a lot of clients who will use case studies, and they'll give them a data set and say, you know, spend 2 hours on this and then present out. I have a client right now that's a search fund-backed company, and you'd be shocked. Out of 5 candidates, we'll have like 5 different responses to what the data is actually telling them. So it's a really very, very quick way to use true data to figure out if a candidate is going to be a good fit for your business.
And Mark, I'd be curious, from being in the CEO seat, did you struggle with the mental hurdle of the investment needed for some of these roles, between the salary, any sort of placement fees, given that maybe EBITDA was not as big initially than it would be over time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a natural concern, particularly, you know, in the earlier days. I mean, this has come up even a few times today at this conference. I mean, there is a natural J-curve element to operating a search fund company, particularly like in that first year or two. So sometimes there's a tendency to be, you know, very overly cautious, and I mean, you certainly have to be cautious, particularly if you've got third-party debt and, you know, covenants that you need to meet and everything else. But at the same time, you know, I think you have to optimize how you allocate your capital and do that wisely. So perhaps, you know, if there's a role that you need to hire for, you know, we've seen a lot of wage growth and the CFO hire in the last few years. Maybe there are other areas of the business that, you know, perhaps you can kind of cut back on or trim down to make room for that. On the placement fees, I think, you know, leveraging recruiters is certainly can be a great solution to find qualified talent, particularly at that, you know, senior level. I also believe, and there's a book called Who, and it's one of the best books that I think I've read on acquiring and finding top talent. One of the lessons in that book imparts that, you know, it's really a core job responsibility of the CFO to always be recruiting A-level top talent for your organization. And I've had a lot of success just personally reaching out to candidates over LinkedIn. I think it, you know, from the candidate's perspective, it does kind of come across well, and you know, that the CEO would, you know, do that direct reach out. And not to, you know, not use recruiters. I think recruiters are very valuable for sure, but I also like to be hands-on and kind of source the talent myself on occasion, and that's been pretty successful.
Yeah, I would imagine the cost of a mishire in that first year is going to be, I don't know if you have any statistics on it, but it seems like that's the greatest risk, less so than the mental hurdle of, is it the right time to invest in this role or not, but make sure that when you've made that decision, it's the right person for that role. Has anyone seen anything, just anecdotally, about any mishires and the impact that's been?
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously, I mean, you think of it as the salary that you spent on an employee that maybe didn't deliver what you thought, but more often than not, it sets you back a year in terms of the goals you wanted to achieve. So we had a sales hire at one of our portfolio companies that we separated with recently, and I didn't think about the salary we paid this individual over the last 12 months, but rather that I wish we were a little bit further along in developing our sales organization, and having the wrong person in that seat certainly hurt us. So it's not, I mean, the money's the money, but the time loss is really the most painful part.
So I'm curious, I mean, the search fund model is typically a young individual is going in as CEO into businesses that are established and probably have a workforce that is not as young. So any thoughts on how a CEO should navigate having a pool of employees where they may be the youngest leader in the company, and or recruiting individuals that are older than the CEO, and now that person's going to be reporting to somebody who might be 10 years or 15 years their junior. Has that been a challenge? Has anyone seen that as a challenge in a search fund run company?
I mean, I think one attribute that a lot of searchers embody is that of having a learner mentality and being open to feedback, open to understanding what, his or her blind spots are, seeking alignment, what Andrea was saying. And I think that is real critical when you come into an organization and there's employees really of any generation, but usually the employees have been there for decent amount of time, kind of tenured employees, and they're proud of what they've built, and they're anxious about what is gonna what the next few months or years would look like under new ownership. And it goes a long way, for a new CEO to come in and ask questions, listen, reflect, review, before, making any, hasty decisions. I think back to like the first 90 days of the search fund acquisition, and you're kind of wired, right? Like from, MBA program and from the search phase to really operate like in a sprint, like cadence. But sometimes like taking, step back, being much more measured and methodical, seeking feedback, trying to gain alignment, and just learning about the business is often, the best approach in the early days to build trusting relationships with those colleagues who may come from perhaps a different generation.
And that kind of leads me into my next question, which would be around like experience versus potential for those new hires, because you've got the CEO who doesn't have necessarily direct experience in that business or that industry maybe. Is there, I guess, how do you balance the value of having, say, a younger individual or somebody who just has raw potential versus somebody who's been there, done that? Andrea, I don't know if you've seen that in your recruiting.
Yeah, I think it depends on the company and what you're looking for. So you have to assess, if you're the CEO, what your own skills are and what type of support you have around you. So if you don't have a finance background, you probably need someone who's going to be pretty strong in the finance function. But there are a lot of times where you can hire MBA grads who want to be CXOs, who are just incredibly hardworking, humble, and they would love to step into a seat as an operator. So I think you just need to assess what your strengths are and what your needs are, and given the situation, one profile versus the other may be a better fit.
I'm curious, at NextGen, are there certain roles where you say, we'll deal with an athlete in this role, and these roles we're only going to consider direct experience?
Yeah, I'd say it's not written in stone, but generally speaking, we would want our finance leaders to be CPAs and have extensive, finance operating experience in small businesses. Raw potential is great, but knowing how to conduct local state tax filings is also really important. And we found that for that role in particular, we tend to exclusively partner with experienced folks, ideally with industry experience as well. It's just, there's a lot of nuance there. I'd call it a technical role where you need a technical fit.
Got it. And then just kind of rounding out the discussion on hiring itself, what about global pools of talent? I mean, these are small businesses, search fund businesses, but given post-COVID, everybody's remote, global talent pools are being evaluated for smaller companies as well. How should new CEOs think about that?
I can take this one. I think there's two lenses here. One is, how do you staff your full-time W-2 workforce? And we've seen more of our companies be open to remote talent. I think folks are looking for it, and it can be beneficial. So if your business can run with a remote workforce or a hybrid workforce, like by all means go for it. But it is a case-by-case basis. But I'll say with certainty, we see a better, more robust applicant pool when you kind of relax, when you're hybrid and open to folks that might not live in whatever small or medium-sized city you're in. The other part where I would say, kind of remote or hybrid work models can be actually really helpful in this space is finding consultants to support you. So I think Upwork is actually fantastic for our companies. If you need a ERP implementation, you're probably not going to go hire Infosys or Deloitte as a tiny business, but you could certainly find an ex-Infosys or Deloitte consultant to help you on your small systems implementation at your tiny business. So.
Got it. All right, and I guess the final thought would be any thoughts on onboarding practices to make sure that these individuals that you've just recruited are set up for success?
It's so important. I think this is where most companies drop the ball, is they'll hire someone. I've literally seen candidates not get a computer or an email for a while. So it's incredibly important to have some type of onboarding program and plan that before you hire someone, because you really want them to have a good experience. Or if you're not going to have it, be transparent with the candidate before they sign that they will not receive an onboarding or training program, because it happens all the time where I'm talking to new hires and they're just like, wow, this is not what I thought I signed up for.
So probably best practice would be have that onboarding plan at the same time you're building your job description and role alignment so that you can pull the trigger quickly. If you're interviewing the right person, you're not building that on the fly as well.
Yeah, you need to focus on the retention of an employee you just hired as well. Yeah.
Or just be upfront that you're going to be self-onboarding this role.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It dovetails a little bit to one of your prior questions about, how to, assess candidates. And one of the things that I've done for years for sales roles and for executive roles is have them prepare a 90-day plan. What their plan would be at like 30, 60, 90 in that role as part of the whole interview process, and they present that to us as one of the final steps. But I think it's really critical that it doesn't stop there. I mean, that 90-day plan can then serve as a blueprint of sorts for their first 90 days. And it's really important to revisit that plan, I would say, at least weekly or every other week in the first few months. I also think for remote companies, it's, I think, very important in the first couple months to get in-person interaction, particularly if it's a new manager, supervisor, leader with both their team that they're managing and their peers, so cross-functional peers or leadership team peers. There's no replacement. I think we can all agree, at this conference that was sold out and had 200 people on the wait list, that there's no replacement for in-person interaction when it comes to building relationships and trust. Very hard to do that on a series of Zoom and team calls that are meant to be more, transactional conversations. So I think like in the first 90 days, getting that, in-person interaction, both, working in the office and also, out of the office for dinners or other things is I think, very important.
Thank you. All right, transitioning now to how do we get a sense of what's going on at these companies when we're just under LOI and we don't have maybe full transparency? Any advice to searchers on how they start to evaluate the roles that exist as well as start to plan for the roles that need to be added for companies once they're under diligence?
Yeah, so I mean, this is undertaken largely by our EIRs, or what we call our searchers, and then they eventually become the CEOs. But in every case, they're spending time with at least, certainly the seller, who's undisputedly the most important person in this. But then typically their top team will be somewhat aware of this. So more often than not, our EIRs will come to us and we'll have conversations around it, and we'll know, some folks are going to self-select out. So I think just talking to the people on the team, understanding what they want. Maybe maybe the seller wants to step away. Maybe the head of finances is, literally this stuff's happened. The head of finances is his brother, and we know he wants to step away too. And it kind of works itself out. But we don't do we don't do surveys. We don't turn it over to a third party. We have our EIRs sit down with the entire team, get to know them, build a relationship with them, understand their wants and needs, and then kind of formulate our opinion in the background based on that. But it's really the EIR building that relationship with his or her team that they're going to inherit.
So in a 90-day closing timeline, your sellers probably are not going to be open to introducing that new EIR to the team day 1, day 7, day 10, but hopefully soon, 30, 45 days in, they're going to be open to that. Where do you say, like, listen, we need to have these conversations or else this might kill the deal because the seller's just not giving access? Knowing that in traditional search or self-funded search, the seller's probably going to be a little bit leery that this individual is actually going to be able to close the deal and buy the company. So why stir up a bunch of drama inside the office?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen that. I've probably seen the opposite, where the sellers are almost a little too eager to bring, because it's exciting. You've got a new partner. It's kind of often the seller's been maybe looking for this searcher to help them get their business to the next level, and more often than not, they want to make those introductions. So I don't know that I've seen that true impasse where they're blocking access. But yeah, I mean, if you can't meet the top team, that's a huge red flag. So I don't know if it's a deal killer, but it would certainly be a deal adjuster.
Got it.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me about 1 month before the search fund deal closed, several years ago. I remember the seller hosted a barbecue and had 4 of his, kind of top lieutenants there. And I did invite, a couple, experienced investors that were on my cap table to the barbecue. And I remember one of them told me right afterwards that, there's probably 0% chance that any of those 4 folks, those lieutenants would be around, in the next year or two. And I was like, wow, that's like a bold statement. I didn't necessarily disagree per se, but he said it with such kind of conviction. And of course, lo and behold, he was right. And so I think it speaks to the importance, like, Eric was saying, that, to get access to those individuals that are really, driving the business during diligence. Sometimes I'm not saying it would be like a gating item or a deal killer per se, but at least it gives you a sense of what you're walking into. Conversely, sometimes it's hard to have an authentic dialogue with some of those individuals during due diligence because everybody's, kind of putting their best foot forward. And so you'll really get a good sense, of course, once the wire is in the bank account, you take over the company and you get to work side by side with them, post-close. But I think pre-close, to your question, Mike, is really important for you as a searcher, so you start to kind of form an opinion and a sense of what the plan's going to be from a human capital perspective post-close.
How much change should a new CEO plan for in terms of direct reports? So the owner of the business may or may not have many direct reports, but the new CEO definitely will. And I'm sure there's a pecking order of ideally who those individuals are, but that seems like it would create a lot of anxiety for the workforce within the first hours after closing. What's going on now? Who's my boss? Any advice on how to navigate that?
Going back to Graham Weaver this morning, I think Alpine actually does a really great job at this, and they coach their CEOs upon acquisition. When you get the employees in a room, literally the first thing you say is your job is secure, your pay is staying the same or is going up, and your benefits will not change. And that's assuming, obviously, that's all true. And then you say it again, and then you may say a couple other things, and then you repeat again. You have a job, your pay is staying the same, your benefits and family are okay, because they're not going to hear anything else. And so, you really have to think about a lot of the people who work at these companies don't necessarily have the backgrounds or same needs that you may have. They are really thinking about, putting dinner on the table for their families. And so really focusing on the most basic things, and that type of communication is incredibly important on day one. And then take those first 90 days to really evaluate, if there's someone who's poison or who quits, you're going to have to replace those type of roles, or if there's clearly a hole in the organization, you may need to start to fill that immediately. But, try not to rock the boat too much in the first 90 days once you do an acquisition.
You nailed it. That was perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. So I guess last question, maybe more so tactically, is any tools that a new CEO or a searcher should use to evaluate that? So maybe they've gotten an org chart. If there's a banker involved in the process, they probably listed out, here's the employees and what their titles likely are. How can they use that to actually convert that into a hiring plan after close?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're looking at a company that doesn't have an org chart, which is, I think, pretty common, create an org chart and, write out where you are today, where you think you're going to be 6 months, 12 months, and 3 years to figure out what you think you're going to be hiring, who may be leaving, and update that on a quarterly basis for your board. And I think that that's an incredibly visual way to see where your potential hiring needs are. That will flow into budget discussions. And then there's nothing worse than when someone says, okay, when do you need to hire this person by? And the answer is yesterday. It's much better when you can say, I need this person to start 3 months from now. And everyone in this room will have the I needed that person yesterday moment, and it's normal, but the more you can plan ahead, the better.
I'm curious, Eric, from NGP's perspective, does that factor into the investment analysis from the firm's level, what the hiring plan is and the scope of that?
It does, yeah. Yeah, so I would say, Andrea, that's exactly how you do it. The one piece I would add, sometimes when an organization gets a bit bigger, you do have some vision misalignment. So I've done this at Vista portfolio companies. I've done this at NGP portfolio companies, and I do this for myself. I do this for my own team and think, how does my own team build and scale over time? But if you have any misalignment, because the CEO might not know how to build out the finance organization and the sales organization and the, whatever the core operations of the business are. So getting all those folks in a room and saying, look, in 3 years, we expect to be, this much larger, and what do you need? What sort of team do you need? And it's an open-ended conversation. Some people might come in with crazy requests, but if you sit everyone down, you can, or more often than not, kind of plot out a 6, 12, 24-month hiring plan and get that signed off with your board, and then you don't have to go back to the board each time to get it redone. Back to your original question, sorry, what was it?
So in like NGP's investment committee.
Yeah, we do, yeah. So we typically identify, I would say, the first 12 months hires that need to be done, and we'll underwrite that and include it as part of our financial projections.
So it's a requirement. So converting that financial model into an actual operating model, including filling roles, it's not moving forward without.
It's, yes, more the identification of key top talent that we would need to add to the team. Like if we need to add another, I don't know, if it's a landscaping company, an account manager, we're not going to that level of detail, but any senior hires we're certainly contemplating before we close the deal.
Fantastic. So moving on off of diligence into, so say first year of operations when you're not trying to rock the boat necessarily, but I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on like how you prioritize the roles. So certainly strategic roles are going to add long-term value, but there's going to be just the day-to-day headaches and firefighting that needs to be done. I guess within those first 12 months, should a new CEO expect it's probably going to tilt more towards firefighting, or do you think there's going to be the ability to hire those strategic roles in those first 12 months, or is that really, they need to learn the business before they really can define that role the right way?
I mean, I think it's a good question. It depends, of course, somewhat on the quality of the the organization and the people that currently exist at the time of acquisition. But I think for the most part, from what I've seen, from the deals we've invested in and from the companies I've run, is where the CEO initially is really day one and month one and perhaps several months after that in the weeds, putting out fires. I will say from an operator perspective, it actually, in the beginning stage, it kind of helped me very quickly get up to speed on really the details and the nuances of the company. So I didn't really mind fighting fires in the early days, but I kind of grew quickly to start to get a little impatient with that. And so, thinking about, in terms of, how to sequence, when to hire, I like to think of it in really two ways. One is, I'm very, revenue focused, so I kind of had a natural inclination to hire a lot of salespeople, hire a head of sales. But that was a little bit before, I think, too soon, perhaps, before the foundation, the service operations, was really had I would say, a strong foundation. And so ensuring that you've got, whether it's a software company, a service company, blue collar company, any sort of company where your product or your service has got to be really in a state where you've got, high level of client retention first, and then, you can then, really start to invest in, sales and marketing. I've seen it like I said, the opposite way, where the natural kind of tendency is to invest in sales, but if you do that too soon, you may be causing yourself and your company and your colleagues a little bit of a disservice. And I would say, lastly, I always like to think of what I do as a CEO is what are the things that I can do that nobody else in the company can do, whether that's trying to source and interact with add-on acquisitions with fellow business owners, get involved in my industry on their board, just what other things that are aligned with my skill set, talk to top clients, things like that. I wanted to make sure I was in a position where I had the time and the bandwidth to do those things, and it wasn't really until I had a really strong VP of operations that kind of allowed me to do that. If you think about like the EOS framework, I know probably a lot of you folks in the room have probably heard of that. Think about if the CEO is a visionary, you got to have a really good integrator to make sure that the day-to-day is getting done flawlessly. Once you have that, I would say it's still not easy, but your life will be a lot easier and you'll be so much more impactful to the company.
It's interesting, your story about hiring quickly to the sales position and filling that in. Eric, have you seen that done as well? Has that been a primary focus of new CEOs, is to heavily focus on that VP of sales role?
I have, and I think this is a pretty common challenge for a lot of our portfolio companies. And if you think of the business you're buying, often the principal seller is also the owner and the seller. And selling as an owner and a CEO is just different than hiring in a sales rep to work for it. I think CEOs have a certain level of privilege, like I built this business over 25 years, I know every customer reference personally. I mean, they can sell and command such gravitas that it's really tough to replace that person. So I think before you go and hire a sales rep that's replacing a CEO, make sure you've got really the right, I would just call it like bracing around your sales process in place, because otherwise that person is, I just think, likely to fail. So if the CEO would sell based on a pitch that they delivered on their feet at the country club, like that's really tough for someone else to come in, step into their shoes and do it again. So make sure you know like who's your target customer and what do our pitch materials look like, and kind of invest around some of that out before you hire a salesperson and just throw them off the deep end. That's my 2 cents.
And Andrea, I'm curious, in your practice, what do you see as the top 3 positions that search fund businesses are coming to say, listen, these are what we need help with filling. These are the key roles that we've identified. Do those all fit into what we're saying here in terms of Mark's experience with operations or sales, or are there a different set of like, this is really the core role that most companies see as first out of the gate?
I see a lot of finance, HR, and then chief of staff, but chief of staff might be a little bit more of a mature, they've had the company for a while, and they're ready to have someone supporting the CEO and the rest of the leadership team so that they can scale. But those are probably the 3 most popular.
So it's interesting. So HR, which is highly process-driven, finance also highly process-driven. So framework, getting back to Eric's point, the framework around the business to enable it to grow, those are the pieces that are probably missing in most of these businesses because the entrepreneur just built it and didn't need to professionalize it. But that's where the pain is felt most severely so quickly. Got it. So I guess transitioning a little bit before we open it up to the audience for questions, what about letting people go? I guess first question maybe is just around evaluating the effectiveness of people before you decide it is time to let them go. Any tactics on evaluating the effectiveness as an individual versus evaluating the effectiveness of, say, the team and the dynamics between the team, and how do you balance the two?
I think it goes back to the basics. Like, once you guys step into a company, my guess is that very few people at the company you acquire will have job descriptions. or what success looks like. So it's really hard to evaluate someone if they don't have metrics to evaluate them on. So then when you decide you want to get rid of them, you have no data to base that on. So then you go to your employment lawyer, who's probably very expensive, and they say, what are they measured on? And you say, they aren't. So really going back and doing the basics up front, even though it takes time, it will pay huge dividends on the back end. So just job descriptions, OKRs, or whatever their metrics are, make sure that you have them, and on a quarterly basis go through and say, like, did you meet or miss what our target is for your role? And that makes it much more clearer to be able to evaluate someone's performance.
So we've got companies that are going to be, or new CEOs are going to be struggling with just getting financial statements done so that they can send them to the bank, and now they need to go through and write job descriptions and OKRs for all their roles in advance. There's a ton of blocking and tackling that has to be done at these smaller companies to make sure that they're set up after year one. Mark, I'm curious, like, if you could look back in your first year, how much of a percentage was dealing with this pretty basic minutia versus actual strategic thinking? Was it 3/4 to 80%?
Yeah, I think that's a fair estimate. I mean, 75, 80% first year, because you have to. The company's going to be only as good as the team that you build to report to you, and the team that they in turn manage. It's just a different mindset. You're coming from. I'm assuming a lot of the folks, pre-MBA here were in, roles, consulting, banking, private equity, and other roles where your output's a function of, what you contribute as an individual. Same thing, during the MBA program, unless, it's like a team project. But then once you're put in that CEO hat, it really quickly shifts to, your value as a CEO is identifying, hiring, developing, and really, managing that top tier of talent. So I think, that consumed a lot of my time, not just the first year, but it was all-consuming throughout the entire process. And like I said, a lot of these companies have never transacted before, so when they sell to a search fund, it could be, long tenured employees who are very anxious and, growing 20 to 30% a year sounds good, but when, you kind of think about, what it entails to do that, some employees, may not, be willing to sign up for that. And the sooner that you know that, the better off you're going to be in terms of allowing you to build the team that's going to help propel the organization to the next level.
So if you're the new CEO in that business, you have an employee that probably contributed a lot to where they are today that caused you to want to buy the business, but they're not necessarily a fit with the culture that you want the company to transition to. How do you navigate, say, removing a person who's contributed so much to the company and is probably very prominent inside the company, but just not necessarily a fit for your vision? How do you navigate removing that person while not necessarily upsetting everybody else who's staying?
Assuming that they haven't committed fraud.
Sure.
Okay. Red carpet on the way in, red carpet on the way out.
Yeah.
Treat everyone with respect. And it's a super small world, and just because they aren't a fit for your company doesn't mean they won't be a great fit for another company. Be a reference for them, help them network. And remember, at the end of the day, we're all human. They probably have a family, and just treat them very well. Be a steward of the person, not just the company.
I'm curious, does NGP have any sort of guidelines for its EIRs in terms of severance or exiting people from their companies?
No, I think the spirit of what Andrea described is right. Other people notice that, and they notice two things. One is that there's a new CEO in town, and he holds people accountable, he or she. And the other is that they're thoughtful and compassionate, and that's a great thing to be. It's a good position. One that I would mention from a talent perspective, and I think, Andrea, you touched on it, but we have all of our CEOs on an annual basis kind of review their direct report talent. And we have it's a simple 3x3 matrix. And it's subjective, but it's potential and performance. And as we sit down and we look at the budget and what we aspire to do in the next year, we'll have a conversation around, we're making these bets in these areas. It looks like we've got great talent in these areas. We're betting the company in this area, and we don't think we have the right talent there. So sometimes it'll surface issues like that, but what it often will do as well is highlight that we've got someone who we think has great potential, but maybe isn't contributing as much as we thought, and that's one set of conversations. And you could see the inverse. But I think sitting down each year and having kind of a framework, a forcing function, it naturally leads to action. And I think more often I see talent in action where things just don't get done. So to the extent that you can make it a process, kind of force yourself to do it, force your board to sit down and review it with you, and then force yourself to make the changes that need to be done, the better.
And what if the answer isn't necessarily exiting the company? Has anyone seen any CEOs have success, say, demoting somebody to a lower role and still having them stay and contribute because maybe that individual, their talent just isn't a fit for the job description or probably the title, less the job description, the title that the seller maybe has given to that individual maybe just before close?
I've done that personally two or three times, and maybe it was my execution, but none of them really worked out. It's tough, a demotion, particularly if you go from being seen as a leader and you manage a team to a different role that maybe is like subject matter expert, individual contributor. I just wasn't able to pull it off. I did have more success where it was more of a cross-functional where, okay, instead of this department, let's move you into here. This is where the need's more aligned with your skill set. I had a much higher rate of success with those types of moves.
So I guess the feedback would be it's probably a low likelihood of success. So if you think a demotion's the right path, you're probably looking at filling that position rather than, or filling maybe two positions then because they're probably not fulfilling the one that they've got the title for.
I think there's one, it's different, but I don't know if demotion's the right word, but we'll see sellers stick around in the business. And the seller inevitably went from being the CEO and owner of the business to an employee, and some sellers take that as a demotion and it doesn't go great. But I have seen a lot of instances where you take away the things that they didn't like about the job and you allow them to focus on the things that they loved about the job. So you went from owner and CEO to lead salesperson, and you love that, and it brings you joy every day, and you're the greatest salesperson that we have. So it's not necessarily a demotion, but it's one where I think giving that person a meaningful and clearly defined role has been where we've seen the most successful transitions of sellers that stay in the business.
It's just to quickly add, that's a great point. I mean, we have a company now that I'm on the board of, blue collar company. The seller ended up staying on. He rolled a little bit of equity. And he stayed on really for two main reasons. One is sales, commercial sales. And he's been very productive there. But also, which I think is really the secret sauce here, it's in an industry that's really tight-knit, and part of the value creation thesis is to do add-on acquisitions. And he's going to be, the best spokesperson we have for how, we've been treating him, and how life has been post-acquisition. There's no better person to sell other owners of potential add-on acquisitions on our growth thesis than he is. So I agree. I mean, I think, the practical lesson for the folks in the room that are searching or about to embark on a search is, kind of keep that flexible mindset, learn more, and ask questions about, what the seller wants life and, to look like post-acquisition. And you may be surprised versus, coming in with a preconceived notion.
One other thing I'll add is that titles are a double-edged sword. So when you buy a small business, your budget is smaller. So if you want top talent, a title is a free negotiating point in an employment agreement. So you want top talent, you give someone the CFO title, but as you grow, that person may not be the correct CFO for where the company is going. So just be really intentional about the titles that you do give. They are free, but it could be perceived as a demotion as you need to hire in other people with more senior titles.
Does this all fall on the CEO, or how can the CEO use their board to review where they're at with the strategy, review maybe key positions, and make sure that they've got all the different viewpoints that should weigh in? Is there a set amount of time in, say, NGP's board meetings where you're reviewing the org chart?
Yeah, I mean, the CEO owns their talent plan, full stop. We're there to be advisors, but ultimately you're making, you know the business better than anyone. You know the people that you have and the roles that you have. You know what your greatest needs are. We're here to be a sounding board, and maybe I love the idea, but maybe the profile of someone a bit more senior. It's more little coaching points like that. The second part of the question was, is there a structured process? Yes. So I think for certain CEO direct report hires, we like to be informed, and that's it. So.
Excellent. Well, we've got a few minutes left. I'd love to open it up to the room, see if anybody has any questions for our panel.
Hi. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. Thanks so much. This is sort of tactical, but I kind of think others may be experiencing this, which is how do you deal with salary gaps when you enter a small business and it's for potentially the same job? Can you maybe talk about that?
Allie, do you mean like when you're recruiting an employee and they want a certain amount and your budget's only so much?
So more so either that, but what I'm thinking of specifically is you come into to a small business and your employees, it was up to the previous owner, kind of like who sort of arbitrary how much each employee is making. And sometimes you'll come into a situation where you'll have several people doing the same exact job but making like very different amounts of money. And just any advice or suggestions, has that come up, and kind of how do you handle that? Because then now you're trying to make things more transparent and foster a good culture, but you have a situation where people are making different amounts of money, and like you can't just immediately give them a huge salary increase.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, you can't take someone's salary. I mean, you could, but that's not a path I would recommend very often. And you're right, it's likely a small business, and to bring everyone up to the maximum level across the board would probably be very expensive and somewhat untenable. So I think you do it case by case. If you've got great performers that are clearly underpaid, like you make those right. We would typically try to structure more of that in bonus than in base, but it gets the total number higher. I think generally having a workforce that's all base salary and no bonuses is just harder to motivate. So I think using bonuses to make those corrections and doing it on a case-by-case basis, but I've not gone and done a full across-the-board salary releveling. So.
I think an annual practice that I've done for years, in addition to performance reviews, is a market salary survey and study that compares, what the market is for similar geography, company size, and industry for that same position. Sometimes, there have been situations actually where, the title inflation thing you were talking about, where I've used that to attract employees to come over, and then lo and behold, like a year later, they're trying to get recruited from some other company for a little bit of a higher salary. So I've had to be a little reactive there, which is never a position I want to be in. So I try to just do an annual salary survey. If you're talking more about day two, or you buy the company and so pulls you in their office like, hey, the seller promised me I would get a raise, and was just waiting for you to take the company over for that to happen. That's a whole nother situation, and sometimes I've heard anecdotally that can happen. You just want to be careful about, you want to listen, of course, but you also don't want to overpromise on things that you can't deliver. You also got to be careful about setting a precedent too, about providing somebody something that word's going to get around probably pretty quick. I don't know if that helps answer, but that's kind of what I've done.
I think we have a time for another question, and then we can wrap up.
I think there's a question in the back.
It's working? Okay, sorry I'm all the way in the back. Question for any of you, if you have experience with this. How do your companies generally view fractional leadership in these businesses? Both from a performance standpoint, but then also transactionally down the end of the road. Thanks.
I've very limited, to be frank. I think it's expensive, and these businesses tend to be small. If there's something that's going to be really taxing, like you're going through an exit process, and you have a tiny finance team, you might want to pull in some very capable hands to run through that part. But outside of that, I could probably make the case if we had one of our CFOs just quit with limited notice and we needed a replacement, we might go the fractional route, but I don't know why we would do that, not just commence a search and try to find their replacement. So it's an area where I truly haven't seen much in this part of the market.
I've seen fractional talent, and I've used fractional talent, I should say, for a short time, fractional CFOs. I agree that's, from what I've seen, that's usually a kind of a temporary solution, not necessarily a permanent solution. But I've used some fractional talent in the technology space, so fractional CIOs and fractional CISOs as well, Chief Information Security Officer, where particularly the latter, in this day and age, I think, really most companies that, a searcher would look at, there's such an increasing risk of cybersecurity. These CISOs, to hire somebody full-time is extremely expensive. I have had good success on using fractional CISO for an extended period of time to kind of shore up, kind of cybersecurity, data security best practices. That's really been the extent of what I've used. I think in terms of, I've seen fractional marketing, like fractional CMOs, fractional chief sales officers. I'm of the mindset that, marketing and sales is should be a core competency. So if something like that, I would kind of view as a very short-term kind of stopgap until you find somebody permanent.
Yeah, I've been an employee at a company that has used fractional, and I agree as a gap measure, it's fine. I would just be really cautious of what message it sends to your employees. I was at a company that had fractional HR, so it was pretty clear that probably the leader of the company didn't care that much about HR because the person was only available a couple hours a week, if that. So just try to, some of the times things you don't say speak volumes about what your priorities are as a CEO.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been, I think, a very helpful topic. I see a lot of people taking notes throughout the last hour. So again, thank you for your time and thank you for your thoughts.
Thanks, guys.